9. North Concord Air Force Base. Situated on a mountainside in one of Vermont's most remote regions, North Concord Air Force Base opened in 1956 as a radar base for monitoring early signs of a nuclear attack. Its isolated location on East Mountain was perfect for a military facility that wanted to keep its existence a secret from the public. The base was operated by 174 staff members, who lived lower on the mountain in a neighborhood of tin and steel huts called Quonset Village. They worked around the clock to protect the property from intruders while watching for potential signs of incoming missiles. The only way to reach the base was via a steep single-lane dirt road up the mountain. Life in the village was especially rough during the winter. Storms often made the road impassable, effectively cutting the base off from the rest of the world. In 1962, the base was renamed the Lyndonville Air Force Station. It was shut down just a year later due to overwhelming operating costs and because most of the equipment had become obsolete to newer technology. For decades, rumors of supernatural and extraterrestrial activity at the base have circulated. Much of the folklore stems from an alleged UFO sighting in 1961 by a couple named Betty and Barney Hill in nearby Lincoln, New Hampshire. The Hills claimed that they were abducted by aliens a few hours after seeing strange lights in the sky. While the story has never been proven, personnel at the base also witnessed bizarre lights in the sky that same night, and they were never able to come up with a logical explanation for what they saw. Since its closure, the base passed through the hands of several private owners. Today, it's in ruins and is extremely dangerous due to its deteriorating state. People have died exploring the site, but it hasn't stopped curious visitors from continuing to trespass onto the property. 8. Washington's abandoned missile silos. During the early 1960s, 18 underground missile silos were built throughout eastern and central Washington state. Each silo was built with 18,000 square feet of concrete, making the structures capable of withstanding a blast up to 50 times more powerful than the atomic explosion at Hiroshima during World War II. The silos were armed with intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that were capable of causing mass destruction on a previously unseen level. 5-member crews manned the silos around the clock and were capable of launching the deadly warheads within 15 minutes of receiving an order. Thankfully, that never happened. The closest the stations ever came to hitting the launch button was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. As tensions between the US and the Soviet Union teetered on the brink of a nuclear war, the missiles at the silos in Washington were pointed at Cuba, where the USSR had installed its own missiles. Disaster was narrowly avoided, and the silo complexes continued to operate until the mid-1960s, when they were decommissioned and sold to private owners. Many people don't even realize that the bunkers exist, given their remote locations and discreet entrances. Most of the silos are in poor condition, and some are even flooded. Some of the structures have been repurposed for modern-day uses, like storing farm equipment. And at least one owner has converted their silo into a full-time residence. Despite going unnoticed by many, the sites unfortunately attract a lot of curious intruders who try to explore without the owner's permission. Mark Kramer, whose family has owned one of the silos since 1969, has repeatedly been the target of attempted break-ins. During an interview with the property owner in 2014, a spokesman review reporter observed bullet markings on the padlocks of the silo's doors as the result of people trying to shoot the locks off. Kramer said that he would gladly show the people the silo if they asked permission, which is what any explorer should do when they're interested in checking out a historic property. 7. Fort Pike. After the War of 1812, President James Monroe ordered the construction of a series of coastal defenses from Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle. One of the sites, known as Fort Pike, was built along the Rigolette's Pass, which connects Louisiana's Lake Pontchartrain to the Gulf of Mexico. Fort Pike functioned as a stopover point during the forced relocation of Native Americans in the 1830s, known as the Trail of Tears. It was also used as a holding facility for prisoners during the Seminole Wars in Florida. During the Civil War, the Union captured the base from the Confederacy and used it as a training facility. The site was abandoned in 1890 without a single cannon ever having been fired, and in 1972, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. By the time Hurricane Katrina battered New Orleans in 2005, Fort Pike was already deteriorating. The storm surge completely submerged the fort, leaving it in even worse condition and destroying several nearby buildings. Subsequent hurricanes forced the park's closure again in 2008 and 2012. In 2015, the crumbling site was closed indefinitely due to state budget cuts. According to the official website, Fort Pike is currently closed to the public. 6. Fort Sagara. Located just 1,800 feet from the island of St. Thomas, Water Island is the smallest of the U.S. Virgin Islands. In 1944, the U.S. Army built barracks, gun emplacements, watchtowers, underground bunkers and tunnels, and other installations near the island's southern shore as part of a planned series of seacoast batteries, known as Fort Sagara. The fort's purpose was to protect a nearby submarine base on neighboring St. Thomas. In addition to the structures themselves, the military built roads, docks, and water, sewage, and power systems on the island. The war ended before the base was finished being built, and it was subsequently abandoned. From 1948 to 1950, the Army's Chemical Warfare Division used the fort as a site for testing poisonous gases and chemical agents on goats and pigeons. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has conducted several investigations to assess whether anything dangerous has been left behind from the military's past use of the site. All known munitions and debris have been removed from the property, and the underground complex is open to the public. Would you want to check out this underground complex? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Mikkeller Safeguard Complex. In a remote corner of North Dakota near the small city of Nekoma, a reinforced concrete pyramid stands tall against the open sky. Surrounded by several smaller and equally mysterious buildings, the site is formally known as the Stanley R. Mikkeller Safeguard Complex. Nicknamed the Nekoma Pyramid, the complex was built at the height of the Cold War during the 1960s, with the purpose of being able to shoot down incoming Russian missiles should the need arise. The $6 billion project called for the construction of dozens of storage and launching silos, and the pyramid itself, which housed a radar system for detecting incoming nuclear missiles. It was the first operational anti-ballistic missile system in the United States, but the site was only operational for a short period before it was shut down due to the enormous costs of running it. Its location was also an issue, raising questions about the site's ability to deter a Soviet missile attack and the potential of firing missiles over friendly territory. The complex was decommissioned during the 1970s after operating at full capacity for just 6 months. Very few people have been allowed in ever since, with most visitors getting no closer to the fenced-off property than a nearby roadside where they can snap pictures. In 2020, a county job development agency bought part of the site, including the pyramid, with plans to restore it and turn it into a data processing and security center. The rest of the property is owned by a Hutterite community. 4. Adak Station. In 1942, the U.S. military established an airfield on Adak Island, a 275-square-mile landmass situated toward the western end of Alaska's Aleutian Island chain. The base was built in response to the Japanese capture of Kiska Island, which is located roughly 250 miles west of Adak, and Attu Island, which is another 200 miles to the west. During the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces used the site as a forward base for attacking Japanese forces at Kiska and Attu. The campaign to recapture the islands was successful, and Adak Station remained in service after the war ended, functioning as a key operations and supply facility for the American military. During the Cold War, the sprawling 76,000-acre site was home to a sonar-based submarine detection system called SOSUS, which was used for tracking Soviet submarines. A lot of the activities that went on at the base were kept secret from the public, including the submarine surveillance. Adak was decommissioned in 1992. It officially closed in 1997 as part of the post-Cold War base realignment and closure, or BRAC plan. which saw the closure of 350 military bases between 1988 and 2005. Over a 40-year period, large amounts of hazardous waste were disposed of at Adak, including unexploded ordnance, petroleum, pesticides, and highly carcinogenic industrial chemicals called PCBs. Cleanup efforts began during the 1990s, after the base became a designated Superfund priority site, and are ongoing. 3. Fort Carroll. Maryland's Patapsco River is home to a 3.5-acre man-made island and abandoned hexagonal military base called Fort Carroll. Located near the Francis Scott Key Bridge, the seafort was built in 1848 to protect Baltimore from naval attacks. It was commissioned by Robert E. Lee, who would go on to command the Confederate Army during the American Civil War 13 years later. Fort Carroll never saw combat, but it was considered a crucial fixture for defending Baltimore. By World War I, the structure and its weaponry were outdated, and the property was disarmed and abandoned in 1921. It's remained that way ever since, with the exception of being used as a firing range for a brief period during World War II. In 1958, a lawyer and a real estate investor named Benjamin Eisenberg bought the island with plans to build a casino, a hotel, and several restaurants. But a court ruled that the property is in a county where slot machines are illegal, and other business ventures failed to take off. Eisenberg ended up doing nothing with the fort, but as of 2019, the family still owned it. By then, the decaying structure had become a de facto sanctuary for hundreds of seagulls, herons, and other wild birds. Fort Carroll had been on the National Register of Historic Places since 2015 and is reportedly for sale under the requirement that the buyer agrees to restore the property. 2. Roosevelt Roads Naval Station. Located on the eastern coast of Puerto Rico in the town of Ceiba, Roosevelt Roads was commissioned as a U.S. naval operations base in 1943. Measuring nearly 5 by 4 miles, the 8,650-acre property consisted of a large airfield with an 11,000-foot runway, deep water port facilities, radar stations, and other military installations. It was home to hundreds of families at any given time, and was at the center of the local economy as a civilian employer. The base had a theater, barracks, houses, a golf course, stores, schools, and a hospital, and everything else you'd expect to see in a normal town. In 1999, locals began to protest the military activity in the area after a civilian employee was fatally struck by a stray bomb during a live fire exercise on nearby Viques Island. People were also concerned about the unexplained high cancer rate in the region. Roosevelt Roads closed down in 2004 and has been sitting abandoned ever since. Since then, most of the property has been handed back over to Puerto Rican government organizations for redevelopment. And while there are plans in the works for residential and commercial projects at the former base, much of Roosevelt Roads remains a ghost town. The U.S. Environment Protection Agency has identified dozens of areas of potential concern throughout the property, including landfills, hazardous waste burials, and a former power plant. Cleanup efforts are reportedly ongoing. 1. Chanute Air Force Base. The Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois, opened during World War I as a training center for military pilots. After the war ended, the base was expanded to accommodate housing and training for 15,000 military recruits. Chanute nevertheless experienced a housing shortage when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 triggered an influx of patriotic young enrollees who were eager to train and serve their country. At its peak, the base was home to 25,000 recruits, many of whom had to stay in tents. The facility was slated for closure when the U.S. began making plans to downsize its military bases toward the end of the Cold War. After operating for 75 years, Chanute was finally slated for closure. It was the country's third oldest active base when it finally shuttered its doors in 1993. Parts of the property have been redeveloped as motels, retirement communities, restaurants, a fitness center, a data center, and a few light manufacturing facilities. Much of the facility remains abandoned because it's contaminated. Cleanup efforts at the designated EPA Superfund site are ongoing, and some buildings have been demolished. After sneaking onto the base, photographer Walter Arnold told Atlas Obscura, "The that he was shocked by how deteriorated it was. It looked like it had been abandoned for 50 years and was covered in graffiti, mold, asbestos, ceiling tiles, and other debris. Old curtains, furniture, telephones, a vintage arcade game, and other objects are scattered throughout the buildings. Sadly, the closure of Chanute has had a major negative impact on the local economy. Half of the population left, and home values plummeted, and the area is reportedly still recovering today. Thanks for watching. Which one of these bases are you most interested in visiting? Let us know in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it.